Hello, we are going to talk about Fay Cooper Cole, and he was an American anthropologist of the 20th century. His specialty was his ethnographic work, and he also was a department head and a professor for many years, and a mentor for many successful archaeologists. He lived from 1881 until 1961, spent his professional life mostly working in Chicago for the University of Chicago. Let's take a look at him quickly. He was born on the 8th of August in Plainwell, Michigan, and he basically was educated in and around there. He went to school in University of Southern California for a little while, but then he ended up transferring to Northwestern University and graduated from there. In 1907 to 1923, he was hired by the Field Museum to go to Southeast Asia, to a bunch of trips to try to build up this field museum. And so, with that kind of experience, he got himself into Columbia University and was studying with Franz Boas there, and he got his PhD. He continued his work, and he was hired on by them as a professor, and he founded their anthropology department, in fact, and was their department chair for many, many years, and a professor there. In 1925, he was kind of notorious for having been called as a witness to at the Scopes monkey trial. We'll talk about that. And unfortunately, he died in 1961. Okay. So he was another person with whom his success really depended upon his teammate, his wife, Mabel Cook Cole. She traveled with him into the field, and she was also an anthropologist. She, with him, did the films, the photography, the interviews, and helped everything work out. She was also a prolific author in her own right, probably eclipsed by his presence, and is barely mentioned in his book except a dedication to my wife, but it's probably half hers in my opinion, as far as I could tell. At any rate, Fay Cooper Cole, he mostly studied in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Borneo, Indonesia, um, in and around that area. He basically was very hands-on. He and his wife would go in, and they would use what at the time was new media film and audio recording equipment and photography, and they would interview people, and this is where they basically went. Also, when he came back and he was in Chicago, he oversaw a lot of excavations of the mounds in the American Midwest, Chicago area, and he brought some scientific rigor to that process, perhaps. Okay, so anyway, what exactly was his data set? He shot a lot of films and movies and photographs and recorded voices and speaking and dancing and doing household activities and talking with people, recording their thoughts, their histories. So it was kind of firsthand data collection that he was engaged in. That's from a movie of his, which you can see on the internet. What were some of his underlying assumptions? Well, he believed that preserving records of traditional cultures would facilitate the growth of knowledge and understanding about the nature of being human. And I think it's for this reason that he probably um, worked so hard to, go into the field and collect his data. He was an early proponent and practitioner of ethnographic anthropology, and he used a lot of new media tools to collect his data. He presumed that understanding contemporary native cultures would give insights into the archaeology of the people that lived there in the past. So he felt that it was very vitally important to listen to the indigenous voices, and he was perhaps an early proponent of that thought. Um, he exercised a lot of kind of effort to bring scientific rigor into his work, and he insisted on that from his students and the people with whom he worked. Uh, so what was his theory? Well, actually, he not on maybe not everybody gets a theory or so, but he certainly had one. Don't know. He developed the belief, and he expounded on it in his literatures. In his literature, that Southeast Asia had been populated by a pygmy culture prior to the what for him was its contemporary population. And so he postulated that traces of the pygmy culture were found both in the genetics and in the culture of the people of the region in his time. What was his opinions about the people? Well, he seems to have understood that somewhere between their present and their ancestors' past, there was a continuity of knowledge, and that he could tap into that knowledge, that perhaps then he could share understanding of those people with the rest of the world. So I think that he saw them as an important part of the universe that needed to be understood, so that it would be properly interacted with, and not necessarily destroyed. He seemed to want to preserve native cultures. Thank you very much. He was a prolific author. These are some of his works. After the 50s, he doesn't seem to have done too much, but he was very, even after he retired, he stayed active in the lives of students and faculty at University of Chicago. So he was the founder of their department, actually, that didn't have anything until he created it. And he was successfully brought that department into excellence. And many of his students became professional archaeologists and professors. Um, and he brought a scientific rigor through his teaching, that kind of resounded, became known as the Chicago method. Um, the Let's see, the fellow in the middle was an excavator, and who went on to excavate one of his mounds that we'll look at in a moment. But many of these folks were very successful in their own right, and it was due to his mentorship, perhaps, that they became enthusiastic proponents of archaeology, in fact. So here's an example of rather than just blindly opening up these things and digging, see if you can find anything, he created this grid pattern, and kind of scrupulously went through and made sure everything would be done in a sequence and very carefully documented. And that was the beginning of the kind of scientific rigor that you see in excavations today. So he became kind of notorious in time, because in 1925 this theory of evolution was thought to be controversial. And so people thought that maybe it shouldn't be taught in schools because it was contrary to the Bible. Well, he didn't. He thought that it was probably a good idea to teach it, and so he spoke in favor of it. And he was big in the news for that reason. And when he got back to Chicago, he thought he was in trouble. He got called to the trustee's office, and they said, you've been really making a big thing out of this thing. He's like, oh God, what you going to do to me? And they gave him a piece of paper. He's like, oh no. And he said, and it was a raise. They gave him a pay raise. So anyway, they rewarded people for being controversial back then. So anyway, what were his contributions? This is my thought. I feel that he created an example of using new media for ethnological data collection. His Chicago method, introducing scientific rigor to this excavation process, was very important. His recordings of Native Asian histories is in itself a very valuable treasure in the archaeological records of the world. His education of professional archaeologists was a great contribution, and his academic support for the theory of evolution in that Scopes monkey trial was also important. So he was well respected in Chicago, and that's what he. So anyway, what were his contributions? This is my thought. I feel that he created an example of using new media for ethnological data collection. His Chicago method, introducing scientific rigor to this excavation process, was very important. His recordings of Native Asian histories is in itself a very valuable treasure in the archaeological records of the world. His education of professional archaeologists was a great contribution, and his academic support for the theory of evolution in that Scopes monkey trial was also important. So he was well respected in Chicago, and that's what he was all about. So here are some of the references from which I drew my information, and you might like them too. I'll leave them up for a moment, and thank you. If there's any, thank you very much. Questions, I'll be happy to take them.